Thank you so much for the intro, Tom and Russell, for hosting us, all of you at the Sausalito Yacht Club. We're so excited to be here. I'm Paul Hobie, Program Manager of the Seabird Protection Network. I wanted to take a chance to introduce a couple of my colleagues, Reyna and Wendy Kordesch. They both work on the Seabird Protection Network. And we brought in a ringer, a real seabird biologist, Lydia D'Amico. She's the biologist at Alcatraz, and we'll be telling you about a little bit about the history of Alcatraz and the seabirds that live there. So while we were waiting for all of you to join, we had a short but interesting discussion about the Luckenbach. And the SS Jacob Luckenbach was a shipwreck that happened in, I believe, the 1950s in right off the Farallones. And our colleague, Mary Jane Schramm, who many of you may have seen speak, was on the ship that helped recover the Jacob Luckenbach and pump oil out of its hold. It's still down there at the bottom of the ocean, actually. But what had happened was there were these mystery spills happening off the California coast, and oil after a big storm would wash up, and they'd find it on biologists would find it on birds, and they'd test the oil, and they didn't know where it was coming from until they figured out it was coming from the Jacob Luckenbach, and so they eventually found the Luckenbach. They sent equipment down there to help pump most of the oil out of its tank, and try to prevent future mystery spills from happening. That's how we're here today. There was a fund set up from the Luckenbach and other mystery spills that funds seabird restoration work, and it's funded the Seabird Protection Network for the last 10 years. Without further ado, I'll introduce myself. I'm Paul Hobie. Like my fellow three co-presenters, I'm a child of the Bay Area. I grew up in Petaluma, California. I have done a little bit of boating. I'm kind of a lousy shipmate. My aunt and uncle rented a sailboat for an afternoon in San Francisco Bay. I must have been about 10 years old. It was one of those freezing days, and I really wanted to use the binoculars. And they're these big binoculars in a big case that I held. I held them up, and somehow they were over the water, but the case was upside down, and so the binoculars fell straight into the bay. And like the Luckenbach, that is where they still rest today. These days, I'm more of a surfer than a boater. This is my home break, Ocean Beach, that you can see. I love getting out there. But luckily, my colleagues have a little bit more boating experience than I do. The Seabird Protection Network works to reduce disturbances to nesting seabird colonies off of our coast. We do a lot of work with small plane pilots to educate them on how to spot seabird colonies from the air and how to avoid disturbing them. And we also do a lot of work in the boating community, and that's what you'll be hearing about this evening. The photo on the bottom left is our very picturesque office that we all miss very much. It's right across the water from you all on Crissy Field. So we wanted to try something to find out a little bit about you guys. And Russ is going to pull up an audience poll that asks you a little bit about the kind of boating that you do. Oh, and it's a multiple choice. I think, oh, okay. And it's also asking you where you usually boat, which is inside the bay, the outer coast, the Farallon Islands, the Marin outer coast, and the San Mateo outer coast. So I'm gonna click sailing because that one time on the bay back in the 80s.
We'll close the poll in just a few seconds.
And I think we can see results. We can see what kind of boating everyone
All right.
is doing.
3, 2, 1. Get your votes in. Here we go. Share results.
Okay. Wow, more kayakers than sailors. I love that. And you know, maybe people are kayakers and sailors because they click both options. And 91% of folks are boating inside San Francisco Bay, but there's also, you know, a healthy you know, portion of people that are usually going outside the bay and visiting Marin more than San Mateo and more than the treacherous Farallon Islands, which is understandable. Well, thank you guys all for telling us a little bit more about yourselves and where you're boating. I think you'll find that the material we present lines up well with your geographical interests. So I'd like to turn things over to Karen Reyna. She is the Resource Protection Coordinator of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and one of the founders of the Seabird Protection Network.
Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much for inviting us to speak. I've been working at the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary now for 15 years. And so, yes, I was involved in starting this program, and I'm very excited to talk about what we do with you today. And just a little bit about me. I'm a boater. I used to race in the Friday night series out of the South Beach Yacht Club, and I do spend a lot of time at the South Beach Yacht Club. I'm an avid Giants fan, and it's right next door, so I spend a lot of time there. So I don't know if anyone from South Beach just joined, but hello if you have. But these days I haven't been sailing as often as I'd like, but I have enjoyed time on a small Grady White power boat in the bay, and that's been fun to tool around in that. Just a little bit about NOAA and the sanctuaries. The sanctuaries are part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and there's actually 14 national marine sanctuaries within all U.S. territories. And here's a map showing that. And you'll see that there's also 2 that are proposed that are new. There's also one marine national monument, the Papahanaumokuakea. And what we are charged to do, what our mission is to conserve, protect, and enhance biodiversity, ecological integrity, and cultural legacy. And I'm sorry that the words there got cut off on the side. And you'll see there are actually 3 sanctuaries right off our coast, and I work for one of those. And what we do, as Paul said, I'm the Resource Protection Coordinator, but what we do is we work on resource protection through multiple avenues. We do research, we educate, and we also monitor all our beaches, and we do offshore monitoring. And we have a lot of programs that focus on that. And together we use all that information to help promote conservation of the sanctuaries and protect its resources. And as I mentioned, there are these 3 sanctuaries just right off the Golden Gate. And this is what they look like. And so you see Greater Farallones. We start all the way up north of Point Arena, and we go down to southern Marin County. We are abutted by the Monterey Bay Sanctuary that starts in Marin and goes all the way to Cambria. And offshore is Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary. And we've been around for many years, and there's a reason. There's 3, so it's, you know, there's 14 in all the US territories in the United States. And so why are there 3 sanctuaries here? Well, what makes this place so special, because it really is a special place. And this is why this whole area of the coast is protected. So where we are is that there are 4 areas in the world that have what's called an eastern boundary current. And it starts from high latitudes and it flows to the equator in shallow waters. And I'll give you a visual of what that looks like in a moment. That's the continental shelf essentially. And this is where there's a highly favorable combination of light and nutrient supply. And as the currents are carried, upwelling occurs. And I'm sure most of you are probably aware of upwelling. But basically what happens with upwelling is there's a lot of nutrients and there's a lot of food for wildlife. So we are within the California current ecosystem. And this upwelling is wind driven and it's over this wide shelf, what I like to think of in my mind as a feeding trough. So you see there's Point Reyes and you see that there's this wide shelf. So imagine this current that has these shallow cold waters, and then you get these winds, and it basically lifts up this very nutrient rich water and makes it available to life all the way from the seafloor to above, like seabirds. And this is what our shelf looks like. It's wide, and then it drops off into the deep ocean. And offshore we have basically these offshore islands. Now Cordell Bank is all underwater, but this is where you see the Farallones, the islands, and this archipelago of these underwater features. And what's really notable about this is that these nutrient-rich sediments support fisheries, and in fact 40% of the world's seafood harvest comes from these eastern boundary currents. So this is one of the 4 most biologically productive regions in the world, and that's why it's so special. And so what do you have on the bottom? Well, you have bottom dwellers like rockfish, flatfish, but you also have what's called these structure-forming organisms. And they are offshore in deep waters, deep water corals, and they look like this. This is Rittenberg Bank, and this image is of an area that one of the leading national biologists from NOAA, who's been diving all over the place, or doing ROV work all over the United States, called Sponge Heaven. And it's because of this rich deep water sponges, and these are also corals you're seeing here. And then you also see the rockfish. And this is just right off of our shore in the deep water there. This is Rittenberg Bank, which is in that archipelago of islands that I showed you before. And this here is a very special coral. It's called a Christmas tree coral. It's a coral colony, and this colony has been estimated to be over 100 years old. And I like to think of these Christmas tree corals as the redwoods of the sea. They're very rare, and this is actually the northernmost extent that they've been seen in California. So we go from the bottom dwellers to the mid-water pelagic species, and that's where you get species like the krill. And of course, you probably all know we're known for our white sharks and salmon. And especially with these krill, it's not just the fish on the bottom that benefit from this process. The upwelling supports the production of food, and krill is a big part of that. And also, we've got 36 species, I'm not sure what, oh, there they go, of marine mammals. And, that includes whales and seals and sea lions. And they support this lot, these types of foods support these large populations. That's why they come here. But now to, there it is. But now to the stars of our show. Tonight, you're going to hear about the secret life of our resident seabirds. These birds feed in sanctuary waters. These birds breed on offshore rocks and coastal cliffs. And you're going to hear from a special guest star to this presentation about the species on Alcatraz, the jailbirds. So some species you may only find offshore, while others can be found in bay. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy to really talk about these birds and why they're secret and special.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm excited to be chatting with you all. So my name's Wendy. I'm the outreach specialist for the Seabird Protection Network. And sailing wise, I really think I have my whole career to thank to sailing. It helped me decide to go into oceanography. So this ship that you see here is a 130-foot brigantine tall ship called the Robert C. Seamans. And this was the very first sail I ever took in my life. Was 6 weeks long when I was 20 years old. And turns out I liked sailing and I didn't get seasick. But I did a study abroad program that was focused on oceanography. So that's a science lab on top of the deck there. And we sailed from Mexico to Tahiti. And it was, it's one thing to learn about the ocean from textbooks, and it's another one to see and feel and smell and, eat from the ocean currents and the weather systems that exist across the Pacific. So that really is what made everything click for me and decided to continue in the field. And nowadays I swim and kayak in the bay, primarily from the Dolphin Club. So we have a lot of kayakers here today, but I'm really happiest out on the water and on it and in it and beside it. And that's really what makes seabirds so fascinating to me. Their lives are just completely shaped by the ocean, right? And we live right next to these amazing extreme creatures, and most people don't even know it. Right. So seabirds live these secret and secluded lives right beneath our noses, but boaters and folks out on the water can get a much better view of them than most. So today we'll let you know, let you in on their secrets and help you learn where to see them and how to spot them and what their secret superpowers are. So I'll mostly be talking about the birds in the sanctuary, and then Lydia will take over with the birds in the bay. But we start off with the Western Gull and its secret life. And that's a seabird that the Sausalito Yacht Club got to know pretty well last year. And for those of you who are maybe not members of the Sausalito Yacht Club, a breeding pair of Western gulls took up residence during spring of last year when there were no folks around, right on top of the sign. So you can see this S in Sausalito Yacht Club has a gull sitting on it. And the gulls, there were 3 eggs there. You can see it on the bottom. And that 2 eggs turned into chicks, and one of them lasted a little while, but sadly, all 3 of them named S, N, Y, and C did not survive. But it's a little sad, but that's kind of the hard life of seabirds. They live rugged lives, and it's part of their story. It's pretty typical for a female to lay 3 eggs, and usually maybe 1 survives. So that's not a totally atypical experience. But if Western gulls were to have a superpower, it would be their bottomless stomach. Right, they're really eating machines, and they have special adaptations for this. They have a jaw that unhinges, right? So they can swallow whole fish that really don't look like it should fit down their throats. And here you can see one eating a sea star in the top right. But once they get that whole fish or that whole sea star in their stomach, they have really strong acid in there, and it's so strong it can liquefy fish scales and bones and whatever else ends up in there. So they're specially adapted to eat just about anything, and that's what they do. They eat fish and shellfish and anything they can find. They eat other birds, chicks, other birds, chicks and eggs, and maybe they've stolen some food off your plate at some point in your life, but they're really scavengers with bottomless stomachs, and they're specially adapted to do that. If you want to spot them, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between gulls. The one trick is to look for the yellow bill and the red dot on the bill. So you've likely seen these every day that you've gone to the coast. They're our resident Western gulls. Next up, we have the Brandts Cormorant. And I really like this bird. There's 3 types of cormorants that populate the area, but we're talking about the Brandts today, and we'll see those again at Alcatraz. But the trick to knowing it's a Brandts cormorant and not the other 2 are its bright blue gular patch on its throat here that it develops during breeding season. And you can see that with your bare eyes sometimes, and you can see it really well with binoculars. So you can take a closer look if you have a pair around. But their superpower is supernatural swimming. Right? They're highly, highly adapted to hunt for fish and shellfish underwater. And one adaptation they have is feathers that are not waterproof. Right? So if you think of ducks have waterproof feathers that hold the air in them so that way they float on top of the water, right? And they paddle around all day. Cormorants are the opposite. Their feathers get wet, they soak, and it helps them sink, right? So when they dive down in the water and they're darting around, they don't have air bubbles to fight against them and pull them to the surface. So they dive down to 200 feet. They are propelled by their big webbed, powerful feet that you can see in the bottom left photo. They're really amazing swimmers darting around. One interesting thing and unique thing that they do because their feathers get wet is when they come back to the surface, they have to dry them out like a clothesline. So you'll see them hanging out on docks and on rocks with their wings hanging out. And that's really because they have to dry their feathers. So that's one way to really spot a cormorant. And if you see them, that's what they're doing. They're drying out their wings. The photo there is not a parent eating its chick. It's feeding its chick. It regurgitates food straight from the source to its chicks. And they kind of look like dinosaurs. I think they're interesting looking. But Brandts Cormorants are, this is a big hub. The Bay Area is a big hub for their species, and they breed locally. And they're one of the few seabirds that nest in the bay. So we'll come back to these when we get to Alcatraz. But next time you spot them on the coast and near the water, check out how fast they're swimming and how agile they are in the water. They're really amazing. All right, now we get to Karen's favorite seabird, the Tufted Puffin. And I think this might be my favorite too. But you might think, a puffin in San Francisco. And the answer is yes. These are really cool seabirds and they live right off our shore. Pretty distinctive. They have this orange bill, right, with a kind of looks like candy corn and a white face, and then these blonde feathers that sweep backwards from their ears, and they're really regal and beautiful. And if they were to have a superpower, it would be multitasking, right? They have this ability to do many things at once. And they're adapted to this because they have this raspy sandpaper tongue and spines on the roof of their mouth that help them grab fish and hold on to them. And then it allows them to keep holding that fish when it swims around underwater and hunts for more fish. So they can swim and fly and hunt all at the same time and carry all these fish in their mouth. It's really amazing, and it saves them energy. They don't have to dive down, catch a fish, bring it back. It's an energy saving adaptation that really gives them an advantage. They can hold up to 20 fish in their mouth at once. It's pretty amazing. But if you want to spot them, you have to go offshore. You're not really going to see these in the bay. You would have to go out near the Farallones is a good place to spot them, and binoculars will really help. The orange bill is the thing to look for. They have orange feet, orange bill, and that's really the characteristic thing that you can spot even from far away with binoculars.
Just don't drop them in the water.
Yeah, as long as you have binoculars. Take a look through them. Don't bring Paul with you on your trip. Okay, now this is my favorite bird of all time, I think. If the Bay Area was going to have one celebrity seabird, it would be our one and only northern gannet. And when I say one and only, I mean that literally. This is an Atlantic seabird, not a Pacific seabird, and there's only one in the entire Pacific Ocean. Right? Anywhere, and it hangs out in the Bay Area all the time. But it came here with it leads a sort of sad life. Researchers have guessed that it made a wrong turn in the Arctic during a year when the sea ice was really low, and it wasn't clear. And one pretty fatal wrong turn, and it flew all the way south to the Bay Area instead of back along the Atlantic coast. And it was spotted back in 2012. So this has really become a resident seabird of ours. And it's been spotted all over. It was first spotted in the Farallones Islands and then seen at Alcatraz, Half Moon Bay, Stinson Beach, Pillar Point, and Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. So we really have this new resident seabird. And people call it the world's loneliest bachelor because he wanders our coast fruitlessly looking for a mate and hanging out with other seabirds of different species, and it's a little heartbreaking, but I really love this bird. And you can go see it. People track and take photos of this famous bird and track it on eBird. If you look up northern Gannet, there's only one in the Pacific, and you can find out where it's been spotted most recently. And I looked this up, and it's been hanging out in January on the Farallones. The trick to spotting it would be to look for a big bird, big and white, with a yellow head. And gannets normally are social birds that live in colonies, which is even more sad. So it hangs out with other colonies, and so you can look for the one odd bird out. But if it had a superpower, we think it would be self-reflection. But anyway, if you like this Gannet story as much as we do, we have a newsletter that you can sign up for. A quick plug for that here. If you type in a web browser, cutt.ly/drifter, it'll take you right to the sign up page. Maybe Paul can put that. Oh, there you go. Paul put that in the chat box for you. But we send a 1 monthly newsletter just for boaters with fun stories about who's hanging out in our waters offshore. And if you're interested, please sign up. And that takes us to our next resident seabird. Oh, Paul, do you have something to say?
Sure. Well, actually, Ross and Faye want to know, what is the life expectancy of this lonely gannet?
Oh, I'm not sure.
Lydia,
do you happen to know the answer?
Sort of off the top of my head, I think they can be fairly long-lived, maybe up to 15 years. So the poor guy's got a lonely life ahead of him if he's on the younger side.
Well, he's been here since at least 2012, so got some time to spot him on our coast.
Maybe he just doesn't like other gannets. I don't know.
Maybe.
Well.
All right. Well, we can continue. The next seabird is much more plentiful on our coast. There's many more than one. In my opinion, it stands up when it's on land. It stands up tall. Sort of looks like a penguin with its sleek black head and its black bill and its white stomach. And it's about the size of a football. And if it had a superpower, it would be jet propulsion. So if you can see the common merce swimming around there, I told you cormorants are supernatural swimmers, but common mers are really underwater rocket birds. They dive and dart around down to 300 feet below the surface just to catch a single fish. And they do that by flying with their wings, right? They're flapping their wings underwater and not paddling with their feet. And they could stay under for a whole minute. So they're really torpedoes with feathers underwater, shooting around and catching fish. They're really amazing. And you can see these if you want to know where to spot them. You can see them from the water on your boat, mostly offshore and maybe occasionally in the bay, but mostly out of the coast. And they have, they're the way to know that they're not other birds is that these are completely black and white. You can also see them on land. They live in colonies and in densely packed colonies like the photo here. And the closest to the Bay Area would be Devil's Slide. There are some rocks, offshore rocks there, and at Point Reyes Headlands. And there's one surefire way to see them, and that's to go walking at the Devil's Slide Trail, the part of the highway that's now a walking path. You can bring a pair of binoculars, and they can't fall in the ocean, so you'll be great there, Paul. And you can see them in the springtime. There's a surefire, you can see them right offshore. They're really amazing to see in real life. But I also wanted to share about common mers, their sensitivity and their nesting sensitivity. If you go to the next slide.
I'll pause for a second and answer Kimberly Williams' question, who says she's noticed birds on land apart from the breeding colony, and wonders if that's typical to see them on land. And they can roost, they can hang out on land on offshore cliffs. Sometimes they'll come up on the beach, but that could potentially be a sign of trouble. But generally, yeah, they're out in the open ocean. And Tony has a question about how to identify the Brandts Cormorant when it's not in breeding season. And I know that Lydia is going to talk about the Brandts later in her presentation, so she can give us a crash course on cormorant identification, because I don't know the answer to that question. So
Lydia will definitely know. All right, thanks, Paul, and great questions. So the one other thing I wanted to add about common murres is their sensitivity to really disruption, and that's something that's true of all seabird colonies on our coast, and that's because we have this rich seabird habitat that's great, and so it attracts lots of seabirds. But when they nest, they come to shore. So when they're out in the ocean, they're very dispersed, but then the entire, population concentrates on a particular rock to breed. So the big part of their population is all in one spot, and they're densely packed in. And in the case with common murres, they lay a single egg a year, and it's this beautiful turquoise color, like you can see in the photo. But they don't build nests. They rest the egg on top of their feet, which is another thing penguins do. But if you picture thousands of these birds all together, and then they get spooked by a predator, or which includes humans, they fly away, and the eggs will get kicked off their feet, and some of them will crack, and it creates this very sad Easter egg situation that you can see in the photo here. And if Paul advances the slide once, you see it allows predators like those darn gulls to come in, and it's their lucky day, but it's not so lucky for the chicks and the eggs. And common murres really typically lay one egg per year, so that can have a big impact on the whole generation of seabirds. And that's one of the reasons why it's good to give space between, our watercraft and when we're out on the water and these seabird populations. And we'll come back to this at the very end with some top tips of what you can do to help out seabirds, and especially nesting areas at the end. But I'll just wrap up with one summary of some other seabirds I'm not going to focus on today. I highlighted 5 of them, but we have a couple more resident seabirds. The gannet is not included in that list, but we have 4 that are pretty visible. We have another gull that breeds here, the California gull. We have the beautiful black oyster catcher that you can spot on nearshore rocks hunting for fish, mussels and other shells to eat, and then the 2 other kinds of cormorants. We also have these 4 seabirds that have the superpower of invisibility. And they're really amazing and fascinating and extreme seabirds, but they're so secret, you're not gonna see them. So we're not focusing on those today. They are so reclusive, and most of them are nocturnal and far offshore and gray and very well camouflaged. And they have amazing things, but you're probably not gonna see them unless you're a seabird biologist studying them and their breeding sites. But we really have these amazing seabirds and more shorebirds that visit and migrate and feed off of our wonderful rich food waters offshore. But these are the 13 that call the Bay Area's waters home year round. So they were here a long time before we were, and we hope they're here for a long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And I want to turn things over to our special guest, Lydia D'Amico, biologist on Alcatraz for National Park Service.
Great, thanks, Paul. And thanks to Seabird Protection Network for reaching out to me to talk about the real jailbirds of Alcatraz. So my name is Lydia D'Amico. I'm the Alcatraz biologist for the National Park Service. And I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up, looking at Alcatraz from the SF shoreline. So it's pretty cool and surreal to be working there now. And my background is in ornithology. I've worked with a wide variety of different species of birds. So it's exciting to be working with seabirds now. And so I'm sure most of you are familiar with Alcatraz. It's managed by the National Park Service under a special unit called the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And I'm sure you also know it as the Rock or the Federal Penitentiary. But what a lot of people don't know is that it's actually a very essential habitat for a lot of the seabirds that Wendy mentioned in her presentation. So just highlighting some of the birds on Alcatraz. And so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to talk too much in depth about the history of Alcatraz, but I'm still going to touch on it and take you back in time with some of these historical photos. So one of the first written documentations of Alcatraz was by the Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala in 1775. And he names the island La Isla de los Alcatraces, which roughly translates from Spanish to large bird or strange birds. So, so you can see in that photo, a lot of the shore of Alcatraz is covered in white guano or bird poop. And so you can see that the island was inhabited by birds back then. And it was a very attractive spot for seabirds because it's an isolated landmass. There were no land predators on the island, aside from the occasional indigenous person traveling over and hunting for eggs. And there was also no fresh water to support any land animals, so the birds had the island to themselves. And so in this photo, you can see there's early evidence of seabirds. Those little black dots are cormorants clinging to the side of the cliffs. And so this is a really unique photo because you can see the island before it was heavily developed by people. And it's kind of hard to make out, but in the background, you can see the faint outline of Belvedere Island. And so once Alcatraz started to become developed by people, the birds essentially disappeared from the island. So just to give you a historical timeline of Alcatraz, it started off as a military fort in 1859. And over the years, it changed management to become the Federal Penitentiary. And then in 1963, the prison closed. But for about 120 years, the island was occupied by people, and essentially the birds all but disappeared from the island. But once the island closed and people were no longer inhabiting the island continuously, the birds began to come back to the island. And in 1972, it transferred over to NPS, where it's now a historic site.
I just wanted to point out, because this is I've seen this slide several times now, but this is the first time I've noticed that in the slide of the Native American occupation next to Indian land, they've painted a bird.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe they were inspired by some of the birds they saw out there.
Yeah, there's definitely a cultural connection, to the island and to the birds for the native groups that were in the bay. So they, they relied on the birds as a food source. So yeah, there's definitely a cultural connection there.
And so they would actually they would row out to Alcatraz and collect eggs there. Is that right?
Yeah, we think so. I'm not sure if it's well documented, but I'm sure some of the local tribes would go out to Alcatraz and hunt for birds or hunt for eggs or just explore the island.
Wow. Well, Martha Chur chimed in and is telling us that it's the Thunderbird, a Navajo symbol, and that she was an occupant of Alcatraz.
Oh, wow. Very cool, Martha. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, unfortunately, I would love to dive into some of these details of the history, but I encourage people to, do some research on their own, or when the island reopens to come and visit. And we have a great interpretive staff that can give you a great immersive experience on the history of Alcatraz, including the Native American occupation.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we'll
Okay. And then this is another couple of photos of Fort Alcatraz when it was occupied by the military. So you can see it was pretty heavily fortified. And in the photo on the right, I believe that's the San Francisco shoreline in the distance. And so now jumping to the present day. So these are some of the birds that you'll find on Alcatraz. There are about 12 different species of birds that nest on the island. One of the more notable species are the Brandts Cormorant and the pigeon guillemot. And these two species, you'll only find them breeding in the bay on Alcatraz. So there's no other location where they'll be breeding. And one of the newer arrivals on Alcatraz is the California gull, which started breeding there in 2004.
Lydia, perhaps this would be a good opportunity for you to give a crash course in cormorant identification.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So yeah, the cormorants can be tricky. It's still a little bit tricky for myself, but during the breeding season, they're pretty easy to identify, but during the non-breeding season, it can be a little bit trickier. But typically the three species that we have are the Brandts, pelagic, and double crested. And with the Brandts Cormorant, they're uniformly black in their plumage color. And then the way I try to tell them apart during the non-breeding season is by looking at their bill and at their rump or their tail feathers. And so the Brandts Cormorant has kind of a darker bill, and the double crested cormorant can have like a buffier or orange colored bill. So I tried to key that out initially. And then the pelagic cormorant it's the more slender cormorant species. And they have kind of a more narrow pencil-like bill. And they also have a white color patch on their rump. So if you're able to see their tail feathers, you'll notice a white patch there. But even to a trained person, it can still be tricky because sometimes you just have a glance at these birds.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And so as of last year, we had some exciting new residents come to Alcatraz. We had a pair of Peregrine Falcons nest on the island, which was the first time that was ever documented. So they successfully nested on the island. I think they fledged 2 chicks from last year. And in this photo, that you'll see the female is on the left, and she is feeding her mate a pigeon, which they probably caught either from the city and brought it back, or from the dock on Alcatraz. And an interesting thing about the female is that she came from a nest on the Campanile Tower at UC Berkeley, where she was banded in 2018 by a raptor research group. So we're able, and her name's Laurentium. So we're able to track her from Berkeley to Alcatraz, which is pretty cool. And so you might be wondering, where and when do these birds nest on Alcatraz? So most of the seabirds and water birds you'll find on Alcatraz are seasonal residents. They'll start arriving in February and pick their location to nest. And then by early September, most of the birds are gone. And a lot of them leave to migrate to their wintering areas. And the peak times for breeding are between May and June, when about a third of the island is occupied by birds. So you can see in the photo on the right, that's a photo of the Brandts Cormorant colony, kind of on the northwestern end of the island. And the Brandts Cormorants are probably the largest colonial nesting birds on Alcatraz. On average, we usually have about 15 to 1,700 nesting pairs. But last year, when the island was closed to the public, we counted 2,600 nesting pairs, which was an all-time record. So they had the island to themselves, and they just, took over as much space as possible during the breeding season when people weren't around. And, and I guess that's an important thing to note too, when you are visiting Alcatraz by boat, when you're going around the bay, we recommend a 300-foot buffer from Alcatraz, because as you can see, the birds are nesting right on the edge of the cliff. They're right on, pretty much in view of the water. So they're very skittish, they're very sensitive to disturbance. And so we recommend that boaters and people in other watercraft stay at least 300 feet away from them, so you don't flush the colony. And that segues into the work that I do on Alcatraz, which is disturbance monitoring. So the nesting season is a very sensitive time for these birds. They're expending a lot of energy to lay their eggs and raise their chicks. And a lot of the birds on Alcatraz nest in big colonies called rookeries. And so my job is to monitor these rookeries and to monitor for any kind of disturbance that could negatively impact these birds at the time. And so, as the work that Seabird Protection Network does is, great outreach on, trying to raise awareness to minimize disturbance to birds, because birds respond to stress, very negatively. And stress can lead to these large bird colonies abandoning their nest, and over time the colony could fail and the population could decline. So my job is essentially to prevent that from happening on Alcatraz. And so in this photo, for example, you can see a visitor has strayed into a closed off area. They either just ignored the signs and walked over the railing, but that person just walking through that area is causing a disturbance to the birds in the background. And so the cormorant colony has they're on alert. Their attention is to that person. So that's one of the things that we try to prevent from happening on islands to minimize disturbance. And so, you know, it's important to minimize those disturbances when the birds are nesting, because not only do they have those challenges facing them on island, but living in a dense urban environment like the Bay Area, they face other stresses from just being in an urban environment. So in the top photo, this was taken during the 2007 Costco Busan oil spill, and you can see the oil slick wrapping around Alcatraz. And so that was a really devastating event for marine life in the Bay. And then some other challenges include plastic pollution. So birds will mistake a piece of floating plastic as food, and they'll ingest it, and then they'll eventually starve to death because their intestinal tract becomes impacted by plastic. And other things like discarded fishing line can be a hazard to them. So it's really challenging being an urban bird, trying to navigate through all of these obstacles. And so why is Alcatraz important for the birds? So I highlighted some things that, you know, some of these birds are found nowhere else in the bay during the breeding season. They need Alcatraz as a nesting site. So the Brandts Cormorant and the pigeon guillemots, it's a crucial location for them because they'll breed nowhere else in the bay. And for a lot of these birds too, it's the only habitat that's available to them. Something like 80% of the historical shoreline of the bay, which was mostly wetlands and rocky intertidal areas, is now developed and no longer available as habitat for these birds. So by default, Alcatraz is really the only place where these birds can gather in large colonies and nest. And ultimately, the overarching question is, why are birds worth protecting? So, you know, birds are, I'm biased towards birds. They're beautiful, they're really captivating, and they've got personality, like the Brandts Cormorant on the right. But also birds are native to our ecosystem. They're part of this web of life in the bay, and they act as indicator species. So they're like a warning system in the bay for when the ecosystem's out of balance. Birds respond to environmental stresses like climate change, pollution, oil spills, or even certain fish populations crashing. And so when the birds are doing poorly, that's an indication that something is wrong with the health of the bay. And ultimately that cascades down to us, and you know, it can affect our health ultimately. And if that argument's not compelling enough, birds are also protected by law. So there are local, state, and federal regulations which protect birds and their eggs and their nests. So if anything, you should obey the law to protect birds.
Well, thank you, Lydia, for telling us all about the Seabirds of Alcatraz. You know, it's truly an amazing place to get up close and personal with a lot of these birds. And if you visit, you know, in the spring, I know the island is closed now, but if you visit in the spring, you can see these birds with their chicks just, you know, really up close and personal. And it's incredible. And you know, thanks also to Martha Tur for sharing, you know, educating us a little bit about the Navajo thunderbird, and telling us a little bit about the Indian resistance at Alcatraz. I think it's an incredible part of history, and also something that's, you know, been well preserved at Alcatraz, and that, you know, you can still see and hear about that very interesting aspect of the island's history. And so we just have a little bit left for you all. I'm going to turn things back to Wendy Kordesch. She's going to, you know, tell us all about how to be seabird safe while we are on the water.
Great, and thank you, Paul, and so fun to hear about that, Lydia. The first time I went to Alcatraz during breeding season was a couple years ago, and I was floored with how different it is and how amazing it is, full of chicks and birds, as Paul was saying. That is really striking, and I think people should definitely visit. You know, we're all from the Bay Area and tend to think that we've already been there, but there's so much more to learn. But I'll wrap up here real quick with our top 3 tips for being a seabird safe boater. You've heard all about these amazing creatures, right? How can you help them out when you're on the water? And the first is to keep 1,000 feet from cliffs, offshore rocks, and islands. Research has shown that at this distance, you're pretty much guaranteed not to disturb seabirds. And there are various places like Alcatraz with more specific distances, like 300 is the recommendation there. But the research, you know, if we're going to go with the best, most science-backed number, it's 1,000 feet. And so that's what we recommend when at all possible. And I've kayaked around Alcatraz, and that current, you know, the tide can get you. And all you want to do is paddle closer to cut off the corner. But you have to remember how many seabirds are really up there on those cliffs, and really relying on the space that they need to survive. So we recommend really keeping 1,000 feet from you know, cliffs and rocks, and that's probably not something you're not going to get that close on a sailboat, but certainly on a kayak and smaller craft, it's possible, and we really recommend staying a safe distance. Our second tip is to know your marine protected areas. You can check your charts before you go. Karen told us, you know, how special our water conditions are and how perfect they are for wildlife. And it's world renowned, the area that we call home. So it's really worth protecting. And you can check the specifics special closures. And there's 6 of them outside of on the outer coast near us, and they're no-go zones, right? So it's actually illegal to go within them. And the interesting thing about those places are they're for seabirds. So those are places with particularly sensitive wildlife colonies and seabirds, like you can see in the photos there. So they're really special and worth knowing about. And our last tip is to steer around flocks, not through them, right? When it's really hard, you just want to get close and like see what they're doing. Are they feeding? Are they resting? But you know, we talked about how hard it is. The life of a seabird and the life of other, you know, marine wildlife is not easy. And so if they're feeding or they're resting, it's because they really need it. And we should give them that space. And so actually, you know, in these photos on the right, you can see the animals are looking straight at the camera. And that's the first sign that you're too close. And if there's a sassy seal giving you that look like this, you know, the message is to back away and give the animals more space. So that's the 3 tips for you. If we go to our last slide, I just want to say thank you. You know, there's ways you can help. We're headed into the breeding season, so these tips are especially timely right now. And if you want tips like that and you want more fun stories like the true story behind Hitchcock's birds and how that relates to our local seabirds, once again, you can sign up for our newsletter and we'll tell you all about it. But thank you for coming, and we hope you spot some of our secret seabirds next time you're out on the water.